Today's guest is Bryan Caplan, economics professor at George Mason and the author of The Case Against Education. Bryan argues that much of school isn't useful, and the main benefits of a degree come from signaling. By getting through school, you show employers that you're intelligent, conscientious, and conformist. In the podcast, we discuss what percentage of school is useful, whether conformity is important, why the educational system persists, whether AI and online learning will change it, and what Bryan would do if he was in charge. We also discuss the Flynn Effect, gifted kids like the computer scientist Scott Aronson, and what Bryan thinks of the AI singularity. Hi, Bryan. Thanks for joining.
Glad to be here, Ariel.
What percentage of school do you think is a waste of time?
80%. Very specific number. I'm not married to it. I go through a lot of different lines of evidence in the book. But for me, probably the most convincing is just credential inflation and how much education has risen relative to how much you really need to actually do the job. So 80% is my preferred point estimate.
And do you apply that across all of school, or is that just for college?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I mean, obviously, if you were to go and break down by subject or anything else, then I think you would get a different number. But even at the level of kindergarten, I think it's very easy to forget how much of what you do in kindergarten is not actually reading and writing, nor is it fun for most kids. For example, it is very standard to have required dancing, and at least half the students, if you are paying attention as a parent, I do, look totally miserable during this dancing. They don't need to know it for real life. They don't like it. And so I'll say that is a waste of time for them.
And do you think, like, in general, besides, let's say, reading and math, do you think all the other subjects are basically a waste in, like, elementary and high school?
For the vast majority of people, yes. The problem is that some of these subjects basically just are not useful in the real world, except to become a teacher of that very subject. And there's other subjects where they're very useful if you can get up to a really high level, but school is just making almost no effort to get people to a high level. For example, natural sciences. Look, if you're going to become an actual natural scientist, then that's useful stuff, but hardly anybody does. And for all the others, it's pretty useless. The only thing you could really say is, well, there's option value. Okay, yeah, but in fact, we've got excellent predictions for most students saying they would never do it no matter what. I mean, much of it just comes down to, unless you are good enough in math, your odds of ever becoming an actual scientist are basically zero, so there's just no point wasting time with it.
And there are many people who claim that even if people, let's say, forget many of the facts that they learn, they still pick up certain skills overall. And I think there even is some evidence that people do, like, their IQ scores do increase after going through school. So how do you address that? What do you think of, like, just this idea of learning skills overall?
Right. Well, there's been a lot of work on this. Just to start with your thing about education raising IQ, there is good evidence that it does under certain conditions. The main thing to understand is that we should think about at least a good chunk of it as teaching to the test. Obviously, if you just went and gave people the answers to an IQ test and they memorized them, no one would think that their intelligence had really gone up. If you look at what happens in school, a lot of what's on IQ tests is actually just standard material that's taught in school. Some of the classic IQ tests, in fact, have a lot of facts on them, like what's the longest river in Africa. That was on one standard IQ test a while back. So the idea that it is just teaching you general thinking skills is incorrect. There's no such thing as a test that you can't improve on. That's important. The main thing that we know about improving IQ is that so much of teaching the test just doesn't generalize to other tests, even ones that are seemingly very similar. So one important thing to know. Then there is a whole subliterature on what's called transfer of learning. Do people actually take things they learn in school and apply them in real life in some measurable way? And the answer there, again, is generally it's really hard to detect any such effects. So while I'm not going to say it never happens, and in fact, I'm convinced that in a few cases it does, because there are people who apply knowledge very broadly, but in the data, those people are just so rare that we just don't see them. So to have a whole system revolving around trying to achieve something that only maybe one person out of 1,000 actually gets to is a pretty silly system.
And what about things like the Flynn Effect, which maybe there could be a variety of causes for it, but it seems part of the cause might be that schooling raised people's IQ or exposure to this kind of thinking?
Great question. So I actually got to review one of Flynn's later books for the Wall Street Journal, and he is, in fact, much more agnostic than most of his fans. So Flynn will say, well, if we go and look closely by subtest, we'll see a number of areas where we are way worse than we were 100 years ago, like arithmetic. And so actually modern Americans' ability to do arithmetic is worse than it was 100 years ago. On the other hand, for tests that are highly G-loaded, I think it was like Raven's progressive matrices, that's where we've improved. And Flynn has what I think is a reasonable story, which is we've gotten a lot better at the things that we practice in. We have gotten worse at the things that we practice less in. And to interpret this overall as a rise in intelligence is just not the best way of thinking about it. It's much more like practice. And a good way to understand this is that, so I mentioned what's called G-loading. Within subtests, there are some tests where they correlate very strongly with overall IQ and others don't. So like just memorizing random strings of numbers has a very low G-loading. You can be really smart and get bad at pure memorization. What's called like a reverse digit span, where I tell you a bunch of numbers and you have to give it back to me in reverse, that's more G-loaded. That is actually using more intellect. And then there are things like analogies or Raven's progressive matrices that are using a lot of that. What's interesting is that if you go and compare individuals, basically these G-loadings are very predictive across individuals. So people who are high overall are good in those most G-loaded things. But if we look at the changes over time, that doesn't fit at all with this general intelligence pattern. And really, there's some things that have high G-loading that have gone up, some have actually gone down. So again, I think all this fits with, we aren't really smarter in some deep sense. Maybe we're a bit. So like, as you mentioned, there's probably multiple things going on with the Flynn effect. Most obviously, nutrition. I've got an interest in international adoption, and there what you can see is international adoption at birth from very poor countries. It very reliably raises height, weight, head size, adult IQ, actual late school performance. So there, I think that we probably really are getting a real boost in IQ. But for the stuff that's been happening in populations that have had good nutrition for 100 years, then I think at least it's not much, and maybe not at all. Another way that I thought about the Flynn effect is just like the 20 smartest people today and the 20 smartest people from 1500. Right? When you read the very best that 1500 offer, to my mind, these guys seem like crazy smart. Especially when you realize they don't have many giants upon whose shoulders to stand. And then you realize their population was so much lower that their 20 guys could actually go head to head against our 20 guys. It's like, at least it's like, maybe we aren't any smarter at all, actually.
Right. Well, maybe the top people had like special circumstances, but
but shouldn't top people have special circumstances today too?
Right. No, I'm saying, but if it was schooling that gave a small boost, it could be the top people, like if anything, are held back by schooling. So they were.
Yeah, but except the very top people in our society, there are people who have all the stops pulled out for them in a way that would have been super hard in the past, and also we're much more likely to uncover the whole distribution, like hidden talent than we were. So 1500, if you're the son of a farmer with incredible mathematical talent, it's quite likely that would never be noticed. Whereas today, that person would probably get funneled into the elite echelons of mathematics, as long as they're in the first world, at least.
And I guess turning to reading, writing, and math, what percentage of that do you think is useful? Like, could you just teach a kid when they're 5 and 6 and then let them be on their own, or is there a significant percentage afterwards?
So that's one where I'm going to be more sympathetic to the status quo in the following sense. Basically, we have a lot of evidence that people, to really get good at something, have to do what psychologists call overlearning. Overlearning is essentially when you practice to the point of automaticity. And the general pattern is that whatever is your highest level of math, for example, you don't overlearn that. You don't get to automaticity. So the only way that in the real world almost anybody gets to overlearning of algebra is you got to go all the way to calculus. You need 4 more years where you are using your basic algebra as an input over and over and over and over again. So if you want people to actually get good, then I think they need just a lot of time on task, a lot of repetition. And one of the main ways that I'd say that's sad about how we run education today is that basically I'd say about 1/4 to 1/3 of American adults are dysfunctionally illiterate and enumerate. Not that they don't know the numbers or letters, but they're just not capable of doing even quite basic tasks. And it would make so much more sense just to give them 4 times the time on task and essentially just have them do nothing other than literacy and numeracy. I mean, it's crazy that we have a system where we have people who can't even read and write English properly doing foreign languages, and that is our system.
Right. It's very strange. There are a lot of people who don't know like fractions and exponents, and then we're making them learn like trigonometry and
Yeah,
geometry.
never
And it's
mind
like totally
fractions and exponents, man. How about percentages?
right.
Look, a lot of people have problems with percentages. If I remember talking to psychologist Gerd Gigerenzer, and I think he was saying that only about 10% of Americans can calculate 0.1% of 1,000. And then he was saying, yeah, but in Germany, 30% can do it. It's like, okay, even that's not so good. Right? I mean, just the basic thing of, 1,000 million billion trillion, where each time you're multiplying up by 1,000 and being able to do that in your head well and compare population of Luxembourg to China, like just by quickly multiplying by a bunch of tens. This is, in fact, a rare skill held by the elites. Even though it's not technically complicated, it would just require an unpleasant amount of drill. And especially unpleasant for the student, but especially unpleasant for the teacher. Since I am a homeschooling dad, I've had to deal with the amount of drill really necessary to get students to learn, like the students I really care about, my own kids, to learn stuff. And it's like, can't we just move on and just pretend that we've learned it? It's not fun to do drill, but drill is the way normal people learn.
And do you think that's true about reading also? Because I remember, like, I learned to read pretty young, and then in school there was just a lot of like read aloud time, and I found it very boring. Is that necessary for some students? They need that like read aloud time.
So math is where I know what the research has actually found on this overlearning. For reading, again, I think that there is a tiny subset of the population that is hyperlexic, as it's called, or at least in the general vicinity of being hyperlexic, where from an early age, just fascinated by reading and loving books and that kind of thing. And those people, they take to reading like a fish to water, but for normal people, it's quite different. Normal people, it's just boring and tedious, and it's like, what's a word I've never heard? Why do I have to do this stuff? And yeah, I think for them, they probably do need a ton of drill to actually get any good. And how do we know? We know just from the amount of drill people are already getting, and yet we look at tests of adult literacy, and it's shockingly poor what a lot of adults just can't do. And this is the kind of thing where it's hard to believe the numbers when you see things like National Assessment of Adult Literacy, but in the end, it's like, it's just the difficulty of really appreciating what life is like for someone very different from yourself.
Yeah, and now I guess turning to signaling. So you mentioned how a lot of school is about signaling intelligence and conscientiousness, and I think those are probably not so controversial.
Sheer conformity. Don't never forget that one. It's really important.
Well, that's what I was about to discuss. So could you maybe first spell out, what do you mean by conformity? What are companies looking for when you say that they want conformity?
Particularly people that have embraced standard work culture, show up on time, be polite, know what profanity not to use and who not to use it in front of, chain of command, following rules. These are the things that people care about. Because yes, there's a trivial sense that sociologists and anthropologists have said where every subgroup is conformist, like in the hippie group, you got to have long hair and you can't have a job. The kind of conformity that employers are looking for is conformity to the culture of work, which, as I mentioned, is not perfectly correlated with the culture of school, but there's a lot of overlap, especially in terms of sit down, shut up, show up on time, do what you're told, respect the hierarchy. That's important for work. There's no I in team.
Okay, I saw a recent Substack post by Richard Yo, and he was saying that it seemed when you said conformity, you just sort of mean professionalism. So is it sort of similar to professionalism?
I mean, in a way, I would just flip it around and say professionalism is basically similar to conformity to what's expected on the job. I mean, again, you might add professionalism also requires that you be good, which is not quite the same thing. But yeah, I would still think of conformity as a more general thing. It's something that is just such a basic human trait, and one that as a parent you can see emerging in kids so early. It's like, other people aren't doing that, I shouldn't do that. And obviously it's not something that adults are unfamiliar with as well. Just the heuristic of look around, is anyone else doing what I'm doing? Well, then I better stop. A lot of adults have that heuristic, and I may be a bit biased because I do have a whole book on non-conformity and how to do it right. But yeah, I don't want to have a fight over words. So it's like you say professionalism. It's like, all right, it's in the right ballpark anyway.
Right. I mean, I guess the question is, if it more means professionalism, then there still should be ways for people to not go to college, and they're not showing that they're not professional by that. Like maybe they're not conformist, but they could still follow all professional standards. And then it's surprising why hasn't that become more common, where people either don't go to college or they do online college or things like that.
Right. I mean, I would just go back to a lot of what people need to do on the job is hard to articulate. It's often embarrassing to articulate exactly what it is that you're supposed to be doing. Like, it's kind of embarrassing to say, okay, with a person of that level of status, you need to have this level of deference. But with a person of this other level of status, you need to have this different level of difference. And of course, it also depends upon gender, depends upon age, so many other variables. And it's awkward to go and say this stuff. And part of being conformist is I don't have to be told. I just am able to copy what other people are doing, and that's good enough. In the book, I go over ways that you could be very smart and hardworking, but still not be conformist. Could you be very smart and hardworking, but not be professional? Maybe. You know, it's like you like wear a purple suit or something like that. And so you're still smart, you're still hardworking, but you're not conformist. And you could say, well, like, you know, it's not professional. And say, like, what exactly is unprofessional about wearing a purple suit other than it's not done by other people? So probably I would put it that way, where there's some kinds of professionalism where it's like, put away your tools when you're done or clean your tools, where it's like it's very specific to the occupation. But then something like don't wear a purple suit, it doesn't seem to be in any way intrinsic to the task. It's just other people aren't doing it. You ought to know that that's important and you shouldn't be doing it too.
Right. I mean, it's just interesting because it doesn't seem like college has really drilled it in. Like people could still be somewhat rebellious.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like they're putting so much emphasis on signaling conformity.
Yeah. So that is a key point, which is that school is only imperfectly preparing you for work. And there are a lot of gaps between what I'll call the school ethic and the work ethic. I think the biggest one is just caring about fairness. The school ethic is so into fairness, and the work ethic is really barely cares about that kind of thing. So an example that comes to mind to me is when my kids were in elementary school, they didn't have enough chairs for everybody to sit in. So what did the teacher decide would be the best chair rationing system? No one gets to sit. No one gets to sit. It wasn't even like the people that need to sit the most get to sit. No, it wouldn't be fair if 28 out of 30 people got to sit and 2 didn't. And it's like, couldn't we share, rotate? No, that still wouldn't be fair. Whereas if that were an office, then obviously you would ration the chairs based upon status or what's necessary for the job or for productivity. And I think that is one big gap. And then in terms of conformity, what I'd say is there are a bunch of kinds of conformity that school is still requiring. So, like sit down, shut up, do the assignments, do them on time. But yes, it's true that there's basically no standard of dress that people have, for example. There are a lot of other things like just knowing, well, what exact phrase is acceptable here, which you might say is giving you general training, like, oh, I have to say enslaved persons, not slave anymore. Slave is offensive, enslaved persons is sensitive. And if you start asking questions like, well, why is that the sensitive one? I don't see, yeah, all right, you've already put your foot in your mouth. And there's going to be a lot of things like that in the world of work too, unfortunately. Bitter truth, but that is life. Main thing, like you said, there's no I in team. So anytime you're working with other people, you need to have some conformity. And as a nonconformist, I don't like that, but still I understand what is required to get productivity. And yeah, you need to have quite a bit of conformity to make a team work. And most work is teamwork, of course.
And even if, let's say, college is significantly about signaling, what's the reason, especially in the US, so much of it seems like not practical? Because you could be signaling and still overlap with teaching practical skills. And yet, in American universities, they just have all these arbitrary requirements. So why is that?
Yeah, so great question. I'm not that big of a functionalist in terms of saying the system has been expertly designed to serve its purpose. Really all I'll say is it's notably better than nothing, and it would be very hard to go and break the equilibrium in a way that would actually be beneficial to the people that are breaking it. And so what exists tends to continue. I often mention this painting that I've seen, I think of like a 12th century college in France. And it's just eerie how much it looks like a modern classroom. It's just a stage on the stage and people taking notes, not on paper because they couldn't afford paper back then, but I guess taking notes in wax or whatever it is that they would have done back then. But the other thing is they just say, look, these are nonprofits. They are heavily subsidized by taxpayers, heavily subsidized by philanthropy. So they're just not that constrained to do what, do what's most beneficial for customers. And then on top of that, and important to realize that the actual intellectually demanding subjects are probably just too hard for most people. So you've got to dumb it down quite a bit. Now, why you couldn't just dumb it down but make it more practical? It's like, well, the problem is that if you were a school that tried doing that, who are you going to get as your students? Probably you would get basically like community college type students. So it wouldn't be a way of coming up with a really high status version of the same thing. Way that I often think about this is like 15 years ago, Alex Tabrock, who I believe you know Alex, right? Yeah. He actually was starting to worry that MOOCs were going to go and put us out of business. And I said, so you let your son go to a MOOC instead of Raker College? And he just blurted out, no son of mine. Like, yeah, exactly. All right. And that's why the system is really stable. Like, as long as people who are high status think that it's beneath them, that is a self-sustaining equilibrium. So that's where I would go with it. And there are a lot of dysfunctional self-sustaining equilibria. If you've got piles of taxpayer money and philanthropy on the side of dysfunction, even more stable. But just think about spelling in English and what a stupid system it is and how it would take like 5 minutes to come up with a better way to spell words in English. What's your hope of getting people to flip over to your new system of simplified spelling? Good luck.
So 15 years ago, it wasn't the time for online education, at least in America, because I think other countries actually had versions earlier. But do you think now is that beginning to change because there was COVID when people moved online and now the technology is becoming even more powerful? So is it starting to change? Because it doesn't seem there's anything inherent that it's necessary to have.
So the main thing that I'm seeing is that a lot of schools will now have online education for in-person students. So basically you go to a school, you live in the dorms, and then some of your classes you can Zoom from your dorm room instead of walking 10 minutes across campus. That's big progress. All right. During COVID itself, of course, then we had something that was often fully remote. And again, that really fits with conformity signaling because if everybody's doing it, then it doesn't make you look bad. But to go and switch the system where you just don't even physically exist on campus and the schools are able to save a pile of money by selling off all kinds of now superfluous workspace, that's where I see very little movement in that direction. There's some purely online masters. Main thing I'm hearing is that the master's programs in general are actually falling, and it's not really the online ones that are taking over. It's more just the master's is kind of imploding is too strong, but the master's is decaying and sagging as people start to feel like, I need to either do the PhD or just give up on this thing. Just to be clear, I'm trying to explain the broad outlines, but it's such a weird industry. So you really do have things like a couple of generations of people going and getting masters in English, and for what? Right? What was ever the point of that? Or even more clear, it's like for a long time, there have been a bunch of PhD programs where the only job that you really could get with a PhD would be being a professor, but there's way more PhDs getting turned out than there are jobs. And basically, people just kept going in and doing something that was, on average, going to be really bad for them. And it's like, well, what's going on? Well, you got a lot of dreamers in English. It's ad hoc, but I don't really see any better way of explaining what's going on other than, a bunch of people have delusions of grandeur.
Right. I just wonder if, there was this fiction that you had to be in an in-person college, and then, it's sort of breaking in a few different ways. People are using AI to learn. Even people in real colleges are going to some online classes. Is that going to continue? Is that trend going to continue? And then eventually it'll be accepted, even in America, to do an online degree?
Yeah.
For college.
So my best guess is it's going to continue, but asymptote at a moderate level. You are American, right, Ariel? You sound American? Yes. So every now and then you can't tell from the accent. So look, you've grown up in this culture. You know what Americans are like. To go to be in a middle-class family and then just say, we're just giving up on this idea of doing a residential college. That is almost like what? What would it be like? It's not quite like becoming a Satanist, but it's like getting a visible tattoo on your neck, not your forehead, which is more extreme, but a visible tattoo on your neck, and the reaction that your parents and peers would have, what What are you doing? Like, people of our class do not get tattoos on our necks. People of our class do not go and do purely I-9 degrees. It's fine to do it every now and then, mind you, but no, you must go to the residential college, or else you are not really one of us. All right, so in the American accent, we're not used to being that snobby, but like we are similarly snobby to British aristocrats in our hearts. We just don't have their accent, which is the perfect accent for expressing snobbiness. What a great accent.
And I guess another aspect of AI also would be it will let people cheat a lot. And so besides learning on their own, they're also able to cheat a lot. So I'm wondering if universities are just a place where the tests are the only place that they really verify all these abilities. Is that also going to weaken them a little? Because people could just, in theory, do tests without the whole university.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you're being optimistic because there's a lot of professors who are not even changing their grading system in response to AI, which it basically means that people that previously couldn't have gotten through will get through. They say the main thing to remember is that it's already so insanely easy to get a degree in something or other, and yet it's still a minority accomplishment. Most people don't accomplish this thing that seems super easy, and it's like, if you're like, how could that be? How could it be that people don't? And it comes down to most people are just so unagentic that they will not rouse themselves out of their ridiculous ruts just to do something that would give them big gains, just because it would require a little bit of effort on their part. So I think that's a lot of what's going on. The amount of cheating going on, I think there's a lot, because that really is the path of least resistance for anything that isn't done in person. The other thing you're mentioning of using AI to learn, like I would say among college students, I bet that there's at least 10 times as much effort spent into using AI for cheating as using AI for learning, because the level of curiosity is just so low. It's, like for someone that would have a podcast to just get inside the head of a completely incurious person is so hard. And yet, look, I just assure you, it's the majority of the human race is just really incurious about anything other than, gossip and sex and sports and violence. And everything else is like boring, 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 boring. And it's like even smart people find almost everything intellectual boring. So yeah, I don't think there's going to be such big changes. Again, you can imagine that finally it just gets so ridiculous that the system just breaks under its own weight, and I hope so. It's just important to remember that we are talking about a system that has been around almost untouched for 800 years. So you may have heard of this rule that whereas the older an individual gets, the more likely they are to die, but the older a system has been around, the less likely it is to die.
Right. I guess, though, we are reaching a point, besides how AI is now, what AI will be in a few years. And many people think it'll basically be able to do everything humans could do, at least all intellectual work. So what will happen then? Will the university system still continue as it is? Or at that point, will society need to rethink things because the world will just be so different?
Yeah. No rich society ever needs to rethink anything. You can just keep going on as you have, wasting phenomenal amounts of resources, and you don't die. So now you might say, look, it's just so ridiculous. People will rethink it. It's just so obvious. And I will say that on some level, emotionally, I feel the same way. I've felt like higher education has been so hollow for decades. And yet after COVID and AI and Zoom school, it's been feeling even more hollow to me than ever before. And yet the actual concrete evidence that it's going to buckle and snap under its own weight just seems almost none to me. It looks like it's really stable. You may say, what is it going to be like when English professors can just turn out 1,000 papers a day that are as good as the best ones that are getting published right now? And my answer is, yeah, they're going to ration your status in English literature based upon charisma and connections, which it already is doing to a very high extent anyway. So it's not going to be that hard to make it even more about charisma and connections. In terms of, is it reasonable to think that AI would just take over everything or everything intellectual? Those are two pretty different things. So if everything intellectual is just all writing or something, then it's easier to picture. right? Although even there, I would say, look, don't assume that just because AI is at an incredible growth that it will asymptote at an unthinkably high level. It may just asymptote at something really awesome, and yet still be really bad at certain crucial tasks where humans remain the superior people. Or you might just put it this way, like the very best humans may, for a very long time, remain better than the very best AIs at certain important tasks, such as just coming up with a totally new question, totally new style. Like AI is so good at, you go say, like, go and write something in the style of Tolkien. But I've never seen an AI just go say, come up with a new voice that's never existed, that's unlike any other voice, and make it, and people have to love it. All right, so maybe AI will hit that, but I'll say, like, past performance, it not only does not guarantee future results, but we just have a lot of evidence that, like, everything asymptotes, and it does not asymptote at the level that the enthusiasts would want or hope for. Sci-fi is not a good way to judge where you'll asymptote. All talk of singularities is wishful thinking. You might say, well, by definition, we haven't observed a singularity yet. It's like, oh, come on. All right, this is something that is fun to talk about, but it really is like the nerd's version of magic. So the singularity is not coming, not now, not ever, is my version of this anyway. I will say I'm the kind of nerd that love fantasy way more than sci-fi. And when I hear sci-fi nerds talking about it, it's like, you know what? Your stuff sounds a lot more like fantasy to me than anything that would be real sci-fi. So not too impressed. But then if you just do the broader thing of what if AI can do everything, not just intellectual stuff, or you might say everything's kind of intellectual, and that's where I'll just go back to the long-run historical pattern that general-purpose technologies take decades to hit stride. Electricity, you might see that, like, everyone will be using electricity within a year. It takes many decades for it even to go and electrify the first world, and right now, plenty of parts of the world remain unelectrified. If you ever look at a map of, like, night lights and realize there are third world countries where the main night lights you're getting out of them is fire.
If you were somehow in charge of a school or an education system, so even though you think that they're basically going to stay the same as they've been, let's say you were able to change it, how would you envision what education should be and what schools should be?
Right. So just to make it non-trivial, I start with, right, so what level am I? What can I get away with? When I was homeschooling, one of the main things that I taught my kids, ripping off of Simpsons, I think season 1, is, Marge, weaseling is very important for kids to learn. It's what separates us from the animals, except the weasel. So, like, a lot of what I thought about as a homeschooling parent is what stuff is stupid and you don't really have to do it. And there's a lot of stuff in school that is like that, honestly. So it's like, you don't really have to do a year of geometry. You just have to do the geometry that's on the SAT, and that's it. And that's, like, way less than a year. So, like, that's always been my system, is I only teach SAT geometry. It's not cumulative. It doesn't build on other things very much. So we'll only do that. And the system is not designed to go and punish my kids for not knowing more geometry than that. See, my older kids eventually did history and math, and then they did, by a weird coincidence, suffer a bit from lack of geometrical knowledge, but they had to just catch up on that. But that was a weird fluke. All right, so in terms of what I would do, so first of all, just get my bearings on what position that I'm in. So yeah, like if I'm teaching high school, then basically the stuff that colleges don't find out about, I'm going to cut that stuff. And then, like, other things. So, a lot of it, honestly, you just think about saving money. So it's like, all right, let's really cut down on the expensive sports that people don't like doing. Yeah, and especially that don't bring in money. I mean, honestly, I do that for college even more so, right? So I know that traditionally there have been some Title IX rules about that. That'd be one where I'm like, all right, like, we're just going to push our limits and see what we can get away with here, because it's so expensive to go and do these sports that don't have a lot of spectators, and we're just not going to worry about that. And so things like that. So yeah, I mean, there are a bunch of majors where they just have very small numbers of students, and so you could just get rid of those and save a lot of money, right? Some, though not all of those, are also the most intellectually corrupt ones. Grievance studies generally doesn't have a lot of students, so you can kill two birds with one stone, get rid of intellectually corrupt subjects, and also save a pile of money because they just have a really bad teacher-to-student ratio generally. Other things, let's see. So, if I were doing doing like K-12 where I just had a lot of underperforming students, that's where I would really try to go and change the curriculum so that students that are weak in literacy and numeracy just get a lot more time on task, and just figure out like all the ways that you can cut all of the requirements so that they can actually be prepared for life. And especially since it's like those kids probably aren't going to college anyway. Who's going to stop me? If there's some state curriculum board, then maybe they'll be the ones that stop me. But even there, it's like, okay, I'm going to push my luck, see what I can get away with. Like, honestly, for a practical thing, I want more practical details, but that's basically where I'd start at least.
And besides like cutting different things and, emphasizing certain basics, do you think there's any chance that by tailoring it more to each kid and maybe using technology more, you could actually find things that kids are actually interested in and that it would spark their curiosity a little bit?
Well, if a little bit is really little, then sure. But to actually get students who are excited to come and learn, I think that's not doable by any human method. Right. So Dead Poet Society, right? Fictional teacher, of course. That guy would be super boring to almost all students. It's just sad but true. Steven Pinker has, by his own account, like 50% attendance at Harvard. He wins prizes for best teacher at Harvard. These are supposedly like the best students in the world, and half of them don't even find it worth their time to go and listen to what he has to say. This is one where just most people are just so unbelievably incurious. And I think we just have to be honest about that. Well, we don't have to be, but we should just be totally honest about that and say, that's the vast majority of people. For them, we're just going to make this vocational, teach them what they need to know. Say, by the way, if you happen to have anything else you're curious about, there's something else out there, but we're just giving up on trying to ram it down your throats. It's cruel to you and very frustrating for the teacher. And then we will allow for there to be some very tiny sliver of students that actually feel differently, and they can go to the University of Chicago or St. John's College or these other, UATX, these other places where the truly curious, motivated students go, right?
Right.
So I would say that I'm talking about this in my mind, I'm thinking about people that are really curious about humanities and social sciences. I think that there's also another group of people who just totally love STEM, and I'm kind of on the fringes of those people. I would defer to them in terms of what they say. I know my friend Scott Aronson talks about teaching summer camp for like highly gifted 10-year-old math geniuses and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, those kids sound awesome. They probably would find me completely boring, but he talks about how he gives them like a CS assignment, and these kids are like a pack of piranhas going at this project. So, all right, they're out there too, and maybe there's a lot more of them than people who love humanities and social science. So maybe there's like 5 times as many of those kids. That one, there's so much money in it anyway that it naturally populates. So it's just easier in a way, but you definitely be aware of those kids. And I'm definitely a big fan of trying to go and just find talent wherever it may be and foster it and bring it together so that people like that can light the way for humanity.
Right. I feel like many of those kids might be stuck in the current school systems, but if they were better or if they used AI to tailor it to them more, I think they could just accomplish so much more.
Yeah. I mean, I think those kids by high school, at least they're doing like AP STEM, which is, for the very best of them, is moderately challenging. Definitely super challenging compared to the other stuff they've done. I mean, I've never met a person so smart where they just said like AP Calculus and AP Calculus-based physics was a breeze. Maybe it's like, oh yeah, that was fun, right? So it's it's something where it's like a moderate challenge for them. But yeah, to let those kids go and take like graduate straight to Caltech or MIT, I think that would be a wonderful system. Again, like Scott Aronson, have you ever had him on this podcast?
Nope.
So he'll go and tell you about, he is just he was a tenured professor at MIT, so now he's at UT, but he's that good. And he'll tell you about how he had just done like every STEM class you could possibly do in his high school by the age of 15. And so then he applied to top schools, and the best one that would take him was Cornell. Couldn't get into MIT or Caltech at 15. But obviously he should have been taken by those places. And yeah, for him, regular school was just ridiculously terrible, right? And yeah, a system where people like him are treasured and prized and are just moved up to the very highest level that they can handle would be a great one. Socialization be damned. Socialization be damned. Like, Scott Aronson is always going to have problems communicating with regular people. Let's just put him in the PhD classes at MIT when he's 15 and let him work his magic, and he'll catch up socially later on, maybe. Yeah. Love you, Scott, by the way, for watching. Scott, don't change a thing. I love you, man.
And I guess just one more thing. I know you're libertarian overall in many things. Do you view school as sort of like a violation of basic libertarian liberal principles, where we're placing children and kind of forcing them to do things that they don't like, and where in many cases we just don't have enough justification that'll actually help them?
Right. So I would say, strictly speaking, no. But, so like by logic, no. But why what psychologists call psychologic, then yes. What's the difference? Well, logically speaking, look, you're a kid, and so unless you have some really strong view about kids' rights, it's like, well, you have to do it. No matter how libertarian you are, like, your parents are your guardians and they're in charge of your life. So as long as it's not one where everyone has to go and do state-approved schools, as long as you've got private options for homeschooling, then I'll say, look, this is one where it's the parents that are deciding, and parents are free to go and do any range of different kinds of education. So, like, your parents are not enslaving you. Your parents are being your guardians, and that's where you are. Now, psychologically, though, I'll say that the way that school operates feels a lot like North Korea. North Korea without the murder, without the actual slave labor camps, but still it's one where we all believe a pile of stupid dogmas, and everyone's expected to listen to them and to repeat them. Of course, one of the main dogmas of American education is everyone is free to have their own unique opinion. Right? Right. Say it back to me. Everyone is free to have their own unique opinion. But if you try saying your own unique opinion, then guess what? No, your unique opinion is not actually wanted. When I was in high school, they still taught Emerson's Essay in Self-Reliance, which is like a wonderful nonconformist piece of poetry. So, effectively poetry. And yet, if you tried actually implementing it, well, given what Emerson said, from now on, I'm just going to open up my mouth and say, I think Ethan Frome is the worst book ever written. Yeah, I actually did try writing that in an essay. And you know what my English teacher said? Write it again, Bryan. You're not allowed to write that essay about Ethan Frome. It's a wonderful classic. All right, so anyway, psychologically, I think there is something very oppressive about education, but strictly speaking, it's like, well, your parents went along with it, and you're a kid, so you kind of have to do what your parents say. In terms of just being a good parent, I would always say, as a parent, sometimes you really have to go and pressure your kid heavily to do something for their own good, like don't run into the street without looking to see if there's cars. But then the question is, how much of what you're making them do really is like that, and how much of it is just you just decide that they have to do something, and you're not really thinking very hard about whether it's really to their benefit, and say, yes, you are their guardian, they are your ward. Part of that is to use your position of guardianship responsibly, really for the benefit of the ward. No one can make you do it other than you, so look in the mirror and try to have a good conscience about it, which is what I try to do as a parent.
Right. I guess the question, just in practice, most parents might not be able to like school separately from the public school system, and they have to pay their taxes into it. So there's still some like question of like, principle there.
Yeah, there is that of just saying like, there's something. So there's definitely something socialist about having public school, especially if you can't go and make the money's not portable, something like that. But I will say that when there is school choice, it doesn't seem like the schools are night and day difference, except during COVID when there was a night and day difference between public and private school. Namely, private schools almost all reopened in person, and public schools generally stayed as closed as their teachers could keep them. So that's a big difference. But in terms of the content or just the level of discipline, in general, there's not a huge difference between public and private schools. So I think at that level, it's pretty responsive to what parents want.
Okay. I think we covered the main things there. If people want to find you online, or are there any books of yours that you want to give a shout out for?
Right. Yeah. You assumed a very high level of knowledge of your readers. So you should feel honored that you could have, or not readers, listeners that would know so much just to begin. If you're wondering where I'm getting any of this stuff, I have a book called The Case Against Education, which goes and talks about all these arguments in a lot of detail. And then I've got my Substack, which is just Bet On It AI, Bet On It, all one word. And then my general webpage is bcaplan.com. And finally, I've got a YouTube channel as well with hundreds of videos. Not many as good as this one. So nice job, Ariel. Really impressed.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try to link to all those afterwards. And yeah, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast.
Totally my pleasure. Keep in touch, man.